So you had mentioned that you were a fan of the comics, and that's kind of brought you into this movie universe. Whereas I am someone who's kind of come into Marvel through the movies. I thought that was kind of a really interesting difference of frameworks as far as how that would like approach into Endgame. Because this is, I think, definitely a sort of difference in perspective of people who are talking about these things as they relate to the comics and how they understand them through the comics and how they're different and how they're the same and that sort of thing.
Sure.
And that's a framework that I kind of don't have at all.
Yeah.
Going into it. Like I've played like the Avengers video game, like whatever the event, and like, you know, just little X-Men games here and there or whatever. But as far as like the actual comic books and the full breadth of the universe, like I had nothing until the MCU. And even then, I wouldn't say I really got into it until, honestly, Infinity War was the kind of spark that then kind of caused me to like retroactively start digging into all that going into Endgame.
That's so interesting. So, okay, I want to say this, that the movies do a much better and cohesive job of characterization of all of these characters for me. And I have read thousands of comics. And so I love them. I think they're amazing. But by their nature, they're designed to go on forever and be episodic. And they're cyclical. And so that in itself is a feature for the comic, but a bug for movies. And so
yes.
I just want you to know that as an avid comic reader, I think you're getting the best of Marvel. I think that there's no better representation of what these characters stand for than what we see on the screen. Are there better comic runs? Maybe for pieces and parts, but there's not a better cohesive whole story like this. If I had to get somebody into comics, I'd say, here's a DVD called Iron Man. That's how I would do it. I would get you into the comics through the movies.
Yeah, and I think that makes a lot of sense, especially with the way that the comics industry, from my outsider limited perspective, looks like. Just anytime that you have writers changing hands, you're always going to have a risk of like the characters that are being written about changing in fundamental ways. You know,
Sure.
If I want to write a run of Thor and I want him to be super dark and brooding, but then the next writer wants him to be super like cheery and crazy, you know, or whatever.
Yes.
Then it can kind of start to create those disconnects that I think you're talking about, where in the movies they've, I think, paid a lot more attention to like making these singular people. Although I guess you still change hands of like the directors and everything, and you do see some tonal shifting in the movies from person and franchise to the other movies.
Yeah.
But there's less of that, and I think just less time for that to happen. You know, if we have 100 years of Marvel movies, then maybe that'll change.
Sure.
And we'll start to see some reimagining, but, you know, I think the limit of the scope in movies kind of lends itself more to a very focused story experience compared to the sort of endless oblivion that is comics, or however good or not that they are.
Exactly that. I find that, so something that you touched on that I think is really key is that it is on purpose often that a new writer and artist team is brought in to do something different with the character. It's a tradition in comics. There are these runs that artists and writers will do, and it's a really cool thing to see some of your favorite artists and some of your favorite writers pair up and see what they come up with. And so when that happens, the expectation is, ooh, what are we gonna see? Just to touch on like DC for a second, there was this for a long time, Superman was always very Boy Scouty and even in his ongoing series, and it was in the mid 2000s, there was this run, and it was Brian Azzarello, I believe, and Jim Lee, and it was this hyped up thing because Jim Lee is this iconic artist, Brian Azzarello is an iconic writer, and they were like, they basically made Superman pissed off. And that was the whole thing. And if you Google any of that, and so it's kind of like because there's so much existing back catalog, you want it in the comics. You want to see certain things. You're like, okay, cool. I've seen 70 issues of Thor this certain way. I want to see this run where it's crazy. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think it, especially too when you're working with like superheroes in general, I think are like very like archetypal sorts of characters.
Absolutely.
They're kind of meant to like symbolize very certain aspects of those people. But imagining how those aspects play out can be a huge difference in like how they're actually portrayed. And I think especially like you're saying when you're working with, at this point, decades of comic history, that if you keep characters just one note in the same personality, in the same scope, and the same sort of interests and everything like that, then like at a certain stage, it just becomes a matter of like, I've already read this. Why do I need to read it anymore?
Yes. And one of the things too that is really cool to mention, and this will dovetail us into the movie, which is, I think from here on out, if you're listening, this is when the spoilers are going to start. And so nothing is off limits now, starting right now.
The entire MCU, especially including Endgame, which is kind of going to be the focus of the talk overall.
It's all fair game. And so what I was going to say is one of the things that they have done masterfully is first of all, I want to give props to Kevin Feige. He is the guy who has spearheaded this entire thing. He's produced all of it and has a fantastic vision for what the MCU should have been and is and will be. And I'm excited that he's at the helm, because I think what he has done, and this is how I think that we have seen these characters have these little arcs, you can take and point out in the different films how they've taken these comic runs or these versions of the character and said, okay, cool, now this is going to be Captain America, or no, Steve Rogers, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. So there was the same. So Winter Soldier is Steve Rogers, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. And you can see like, oh, cool, in the comics, they did this for 12 issues, 24 issues. This was kind of the arc. Marvel Cinematic, I think that's where they have DC beaten hands down, is they can look at their back catalog. They can take the soul of something, the sort of, Joseph Campbellian monomyth, and say, here is the soul of this story. We're going to take that, keep those quantum bones, and we're going to plug it into the MCU now and make it fit. And they have done that so well. And so even, I guess we'll just jump right into it.
Yeah.
Thick Thor. Thick with two C's. I saw that as a nod to, there's a run by a writer named Jason Aaron. It's really good. It's a Thor run. And it's, I don't want to spoil anything about the comic, but in the comic, it's told through the eyes of King Thor. And he's very old. Oh. And he looks a lot like what we saw. And so to me, interesting. I saw that as, oh, this is King Thor. And so I probably was a little more accepting of it than many who had the problem with it initially. And I will say, I did have some problems with it. But yes, I wasn't quite as up in arms immediately, like, what?
So that's a tricky one, because I'm very divided as far as the whole Thor portrayal in Endgame, because I think that in a certain sense it makes a lot of sense that for somebody who's gone through, like, nobody's had as rough of a go in the Marvel universe as Thor has had. It's just been disaster and tragedy after disaster and tragedy. His mom has died, his brother has died, his father's dead, he had to kill his sister, he's lost his hammer, he failed to kill Thanos. Like, literally, it's just, they just keep racking up. So, like, I think that falling into a state of disrepair is, at that point, an inevitability in a certain amount of sense. Like, you can't go through all that without having some level of coping that you're going to have to go through to survive, just to try to bear the brunt of so much tragedy and failure. But where it kind of came off the rails a little bit for me was, and I know it's tough because I can justify all the decisions that they made, but it still felt weird to me, of like, they've kind of built Thor up to be the comedy end of the Avengers through things like Ragnarok, which I thought was great for what it did in that sort of sense. Like, it's a hilarious movie. But I'm particularly sensitive, and I can admit that this is a bias on my end, of like using like depression and loss of identity as a comedic crutch. And in Endgame, it was almost exclusively comedic. Like, there were serious parts, and those were interesting. But some of that got a little bit tough to like really buy into. Again, that's not necessarily like they wrote it bad. It's just like that's something that I have sort of an innate sensitivity to.
Sure.
So it took me out of the movie a little bit.
Sure.
Seeing that.
And that is 100% valid from where I'm sitting. I feel the same way. And I think if I had to put a theme on how I feel about this movie, you summed it up by saying, I can justify a lot of the decisions that they made. I feel that I can clearly follow the line of logic, but it doesn't mean that I loved every facet of it. But as a writer myself, I can say, yeah, of option A, B, and C, this is the one that fits in this cornucopia of spinning plates, you know? And so, for me, the comedic element was there. Like you said, they made almost a mockery of it. I think what saved that for me personally was that moment in the house where Professor Hulk, also from the 90s, so we saw Professor Hulk. That's another iteration that I mentioned. I'll try to mention them as I think of them.
For sure.
But when he mentioned Thanos' name and you see Thor have a real moment, I felt like Chris Hemsworth sold that for me amidst the Fortnite and drinking. Yeah. You know, where he just grabbed his shirt, and I thought, this guy's acting funny as a cover-up. He is putting on airs, and he's trying to be the butt of a joke and because if he thinks about reality for half a second, he's just tormented.
Yeah, and that's a very valid point that I saw brought up that kind of shifted my color on it a little bit. And the second viewing of the movie kind of helped too, because my immediate reaction was like, I really don't like this. Like I had a very bad reaction to it the first time that I saw it. But then I saw somebody say exactly that of like, some people, their coping mechanism in world, like in universe, is humor. Like when the reality is so difficult to bear that the only thing that you can do is poke fun at you and the world and everything,
right?
At kind of the absurdity of it. And that's how some people deal with struggle. And that's not how I deal with struggle, so it came across a very different way to me. But seeing a couple of people kind of jump up to the defense of like, no, when I have a tough time, like, I like to crack jokes about myself, and I like to kind of put myself in those situations because it'll make me forget the pain, you know, because I'll use it to laugh.
Exactly.
You know, that sort of thing. So that kind of helped to color the perception of it a bit different in my mind when somebody brought that point up.
The other thing, too, is from a writer's perspective, you know, it not sensitively, but like, okay, brass tacks, I don't want broody Thor this whole movie. It's just, it's the wrong note for all the other things we have going on, because we've got one of the darkest Tony Starks we've had and one of the grimmest Captain Americas we've had. And so it's kind of like, and rightfully so. But I also, I'm like, okay, as a writer, I gotta put some of that in there. And that's I'd rather that than broody Thor, because I don't want to see mopey Thor. So maybe something in the middle would have worked a little better. And that sort of dovetails into one of the themes to this. The way they wrote the script to me was they subverted expectations all the way through, I feel. But they did it in a way that I don't think broke any promises. And that is such a fine line to walk. And so I got to ask you, what were you thinking in the first, say, 15 minutes of the movie where they find Thanos and cut off his head? Were you like, what are we going to do for the next 2 hours? Like, what? Because I genuinely was like, what?
So it's funny that you bring that up and that it was kind of a surprise moment for you. And like I wish that I had like made an awesome predictions video before I saw Endgame, because that was one of the things that I totally nailed and I called that was going to happen. Actually, I was like, I think they're going to kill Thanos like right off the bat and just have him be gone. So it actually didn't surprise me. I mean, in a sense that, like, oh, they actually did it. Like, that was a thought that I had in my head, and then they actually did it. Like, there was kind of a moment there. But it was something that was kind of on my radar. Now, part of that is just that I had seen... there's been obviously a lot of rumblings about the quantum realm time travel possibility for a while now. Basically, since they talked about it in Ant-Man.
Yeah.
Ant-Man and the Wasp. So I had heard enough rumor milling going on of like, maybe that's what they're going to do in Endgame, that they're going to use that to go back. So I thought, like, if that's the case, then the only reason that they would go back is if you can't solve things now. So that means something has to happen now that's going to stop them from being able to do anything about it. And it was just kind of one of those things that for some reason it clicked in my brain. I'm not trying to say that I'm some like screenwriting genius and like calculated. It was just like a weird thought that happened to be right, but
that's crazy. So the thing that I will say, I assumed they were going to confront him early, but I didn't think they were going to kill him. I thought there was going to be maybe a prisoner situation. I sort of started to dream up some scenes of the dialogue that would happen between them, or I don't know. I didn't expect them to behead him immediately. And so I think one of the big things that happened in that was, from a meta perspective, it knocked me off tilt. And I feel like I had to see the movie the second time because just inherently, I think as a culture, we have been trained for a 3-act structure. So we kind of feel the ups and downs. We know where something's headed peripherally. And this was sort of like, put on a blindfold and spin me around. So I was like, what?
Like, even guessing that it was going to happen, kind of, it was still, like you say, it was still a bit of a system shock of like, okay, we've kind of got the cart before the horse here a little bit. Like, the story is, like, in a sense, been resolved already, in the sense that it's impossible to resolve. So it's just like, you start the movie, and you start it at the end, and then you end it in the first 10 minutes, and then it's like, okay, wait, what? And, like, I'm totally with you that, like, it was very hard to kind of wrap my brain around the structure of the movie while I was watching it. Like, I kept finding myself, like, trying to figure out what they would even do. Like, okay, like, Thanos is dead. Like, now what? And I think that's exactly what they were going for,
Absolutely.
I imagine. Of, like, we got him, stones are gone, what do we do?
Absolutely.
And, like, I felt that just as much as a viewer as I did, like, as a story character perspective of just, like, okay, there's, like, complete reset button. Like, we're pumping the brakes, that whole storyline is stopped and it's finished. So if it's going to go forward, it's going to have to go forward in a different way because the previous avenues are gone.
Yeah, and I think that I respect them so much as writers for saying, okay, let's just do that. That's it. Now we have to write ourselves out of this. And
because I think it would have been very easy. Sorry to interrupt you. I think it would have been very easy to just like have this be let's get to Thanos. We'll fight through his armies. We eventually get to him. We get the gauntlet back, and we do the thing. Like that's a very serviceable end game potential script that they could have gone with.
Absolutely. But
they totally threw that out. And the thing that tricked me, I think, even more so than the Thanos dying part, was the time jump. Once the 5 years later came up on screen, I was like, what?
Right.
Like,
and okay, so let's talk about that, because one of the things that this, I think, and it's difficult to call it a film because it really, is it a two-parter? Is this the second act of, however you want to word it, but the story of Infinity War and Endgame together, one of the things that I think they did that was, I've never seen before, never in a superhero movie especially, was failure to that degree that felt permanent and to kind of dovetail and clip this thought onto this as we continue, death felt final. And it never feels final.
Yeah.
In a superhero movie or a superhero in a comic. And so those two things, they failed and they didn't sweep it under the rug. They actually dealt with the fallout of the failure. And then death felt like, well, no, when someone dies, they're dead.
Yeah. Oh, I'm exactly with you there. Like it's so rare in movies in general, and the superhero movies especially, that like if something bad at a catastrophic level happens, it's almost always resolved by the end of that movie or that comic. Like, correct me if I'm wrong, because again, I haven't read them personally, but I've since been learning a lot about the Infinity War, like actual comics. That when Thanos does the snap, that they basically reverse it like almost right away, like pretty close to right away.
Sure, yeah. So a quick aside, I'll just kind of give you this: the comics version, and when it was written.
I know it's different in a lot of ways.
It's super cheesy. It doesn't hold up, and I wouldn't read it unless you're doing it for a fun experiment. It is nothing. Yeah. It's so contrived, and I love Jim Starlin, so if he ever hears this, I get it. But it's to the point to where like things like Doctor Doom is there, and they're narrating what they're doing. Like, it's a good thing I have this gravity belt so that I can fly. Because he's never flown before, and there's stuff like that. So anyway, it is pretty ham-fisted. So yes, it's exactly like, so you're bang on.
Yeah, but it's just a common superhero trope of like, oh, they failed. Oh, just kidding. They found a way to turn it around. Like, even though it looked like all was lost, they managed to get there.
Yep.
So I loved in Endgame that they just didn't do that. It was like, no. You didn't fail and then pick yourself back up and get them. You failed. Like, just outright, dead stop. You lost. And the world's going to have to live with that. And, like, and that was basically the entire first third of the movie, was, like, seeing what that means, which I thought was great.
Yeah, and I think it could have been a slog, but I liked that they gave it the time that it would actually need to feel like you were wallowing in failure. One of the smallest details that I thought, this is a movie about rising from failure, is if you look at Black Widow's hair, the blonde from the last movie of having grown out in her roots is still there. And it's like, that's such a realistic touch of she doesn't care anymore. And I thought, and she's just defeated. Everyone was defeated. And I thought one of my favorite scenes was the meager, basically, pageantry of the meeting of them. Just, what are we defending now? A husk?
Yeah, like, what are we doing about the underwater earthquake? Nothing. It's an underwater earthquake. There's nothing to do. There's nothing to defend. There's nothing to save. Just like that's the only life that they've known for so long, that like leaving that seems impossible, but at the same time staying there is like equally as impossible, you know?
Yep.
So it's like, it was very interesting. And they played really nicely with kind of the different ways and that people recover or don't recover from tragedy, because some of the characters' lives are almost unanimously better than pre-Endgame, which is kind of scary to think about, that like the best things that could happen to them are the result of, you know, this incredibly, you know, universe-wide tragic destruction. So you see people like Iron Man, who's the happiest that he's maybe been ever, like in the movies. Like,
yeah.
His wife survived the snap too, and so did he. He managed to like barely get back to Earth on the ship, and he's got the kid that he wanted, and he's settled out of the superhero life. He's found a comfortable spot that's like genuinely fulfilling, and like Hulk has kind of moved in that direction a lot too. Of like, he solved his problems with the Hulk, which, super side note, I understand, because like Endgame's a 3-hour movie already, so you know you can't really ask for too much additions to the movie without it being insane. I wish we could have seen Hulk's resolution on screen just because of how much time they spent setting it up across the Marvel universe, and especially in Endgame, of like how deep-rooted that struggle between him and the Hulk was. To see it just like gone off screen was a little disappointing to me.
Sure.
Again, I see why they did it. It's not a huge deal. I'm not broken up over the movie about it. But like even Hulk's in like a better spot than he's ever been. He's solved his problem with the Hulk. He has adoring fans now and like everything. And then on the other hand, you have, like you were saying, Black Widow, who's gone totally to shit. Captain America's like trying to lead a support group to cope with it.
Yeah.
Just all these like, you see these huge gaps of like people, and Thor's obviously way down about it too. Like just the different ways that they managed to build up everybody's different arcs leading into kind of the turning point at the end of Act 1, going into the actual time travel thing.
Yeah, and I feel like, okay, so let's talk about the Hulk a little bit. One of the things that I felt was I would have liked to have seen his arc on screen. Okay, but one of the things that I know is that for the Marvel Cinematic Universe, one of the things they're very good at doing is making you think they forgot something so that they can give it the time it deserves somewhere else.
Yes.
And I don't want to make wholesale excuses because there are arguably a lot of different quote-unquote plot holes and things like that. But I have given my trust to Kevin Feige and the Russo brothers because they've earned it. I've heard them in interviews. Yeah. I don't think that these are mistakes, is I guess my point.
Yeah.
I think a lot of this is deliberate. And so what I'm hoping, and I'm probably setting myself up for disappointment, what I'm hoping is that we are going to see that same arc, but in a reversion story, where he can't hold it together and it's reverting back to Hulk. Oh. And so we get to sort of see a fall rather than a build. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so the union starts to tear, and he can't quite keep the cohesion that they've built as a pair.
Yes.
And then you can kind of revisit the off-screen unifying arc by exploring it in a different area.
Right. And I think they're smart about being able to pull that kind of stuff off and say, okay, what are we going to do? Because there are a couple of different Hulks that we haven't seen yet that I think we could see in the next phase of films. Because we've introduced time travel, there's a Hulk called Maestro. And if you Google Maestro, he's basically he has this gray beard and he is this sort of smart Hulk, but he's become a totalitarian dictator. He basically is like, Hulk is the smartest and strongest one there is. And so Maestro is basically just this ruler. And so he comes back from the future and is like, yeah, I'm going to take over. And so we could see some Maestro action. There's also another Hulk called Savage Hulk. And Savage Hulk is an unbridled, deadly, very, very primal version. Worse than anything we've seen. So Savage Hulk is like brutal, murderous, similar to what we actually saw in Age of Ultron when Scarlet Witch kind of red-eyed him. So anyway, I think that they accelerated that so that we could see some sort of shift in another film.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point there that I have a really difficult time, especially being less versed in the Marvel universe than people who are super familiar with the comics like you, of like finding out what's a dropped thread and what's a sequel bait thread. And Endgame very, I think, consciously plays with those elements of like, you thought that we would let that slip, but really that was just a little hint because, this movie's going to come out in 2021 and we want to explore it in its full depth in that movie or whatever. So they've kind of, it's difficult because part of me feels like that's kind of a cop-out, but also part of me is Like, well, they're building this empire, and that has to kind of go somewhere. So what do you do with that? Obviously, if you resolve everything in each movie, then you kind of have that very episodic feel to the movie universe that doesn't feel as natural as it does in a comic universe. So you kind of have to drop little things and let things kind of taper off, because then you can pick them back up in, Guardians of the Galaxy 3
Yep.
or Avengers 5, whatever that's going to be, or Doctor Strange 2, or, whatever, all these movies that are on the slate, so to speak. So it's difficult to kind of unravel the tapestry sometimes and see, like, what's a genuine criticism you can make about Endgame versus what's a conscious setup for a future project that they haven't let us in on yet.
Yeah, and it's tough because it also has to stand alone as a piece of entertainment. So it has to be fulfilling enough, as you're saying, that it's like it can't be an excuse to not give me some sort of a closure. But I feel like there are some things that were glanced over very purposefully. Primarily, Steve Rogers, Captain America, bringing the gems back off screen.
Yes.
I think that's going to be a huge setup for the next phase. I think they have made it very clear. There's a scene where the Ancient One talks to Banner, Bruce Banner, because he's been disembodied, right? So we get to see Mark Ruffalo on screen. They make it very clear that if the Infinity Stones leave a timeline, that timeline is in deep trouble. They say that. Now, they say that after we find out that Thanos has destroyed this timeline's Infinity Stones.
Yes,
right?
Exactly.
So I don't think that is... I think that was the setup for Phase 4, which is now things like, okay, just one example, Dormammu comes, Doctor Strange doesn't have the Time Stone, Dormammu eats the universe. There are so many pieces where the Time Stone, the Reality Stone, like all these different... at the time we didn't know they were all Infinity Stones, but the point is they all played a really big part in their respective movies for solving a problem and being a MacGuffin. And what happens when you don't have those things? So I think that was the setup of, hey guys, probably going to bring in these big outside threats, and they're not going to have the Infinity Stones.
I've seen a lot of rumblings that this may be their way to tie in, because now that Marvel has the rights that they want to all their stuff, of like, maybe this is how we get Fantastic Four and Galactus. The Infinity Stones were keeping him away, or whatever, in the universe explanation they want to use. Those are gone. Boom! You have your next level scale up of universal threat, and so on. And you can use that as an excuse to start bringing in these other franchise characters that the Marvel Cinematic Universe now has rights to use in their films again.
Right. And I agree with that. And I'm a huge Galactus fan. So I'm actually showing, if you're listening to the audio, I'm showing Galactus. And I did not plan this, but also...
Oh. Yeah, Galactus shirt on too.
He's in the exact same pose, which I didn't even realize. But I think that the other thing the Marvel Cinematic Universe is brilliant at is they have their finger on the pulse of what story to tell, and they get it. They have masterfully made it so that we're not fatigued. We might be worn out, but we're not like, ugh, I'm done. And a perfect example of this is Spider-Man Far From Home. This is a brilliant move from them. It also shows that, listen, they are absolutely given to blatantly lying to protect the integrity of these storylines. They made it very clear that Spider-Man Far From Home was going to be the first film in Phase 4. It has now been revealed that it is actually the last film of Phase 3, which also gives me a ton of meta, like, oh, okay, put a pin in all of the things that I was concerned about for Endgame, because this is actually it's sort of I can't think of the word. What is it at the end of the story? It's not the falling action. Where they wrap up the story at the end? I can't think of what it's called.
Yeah.
Denouement?
Resolution?
Yeah, the resolution,
I don't know. Yeah.
The prologue, the epilogue, whatever it is. This is the bookend. Is the bookend where I think we're going to get a lot of closure, especially because, again, spoilers, but if you've seen the trailer, they waited to release the trailer that has Tony Stark in it. And they're like, hey, look, Iron Man's gone. How's the world dealing with that? How's Spider-Man dealing with that? And I don't know. I'm really excited about all that.
Definitely. It creates a really interesting... I think you bring up a good point, too, about like kind of balancing all the stories, is because Spider-Man, at this stage, now that we see him in Infinity War and Endgame, it's obviously a little bit different. But Spider-Man's a very, like, on-the-ground hero. Right. Versus, like, the sort of cosmic level stuff that the last couple of movies have been between Captain Marvel and Infinity War and Endgame, obviously. I think it's a good way to kind of both wrap up this sort of entire arc, like you say, of like seeing a post-Tony Stark, post-snap and then unsnap world.
Yeah.
And then also kind of moving back to a more grounded place as well, where instead of, planets and moons exploding and the universe being threatened, we're going to see, a city being threatened or an important person and so on.
Yeah, bringing it back down.
That kind of helps balance out the fatigue, too, kind of telling in a different scope.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I think that... have you seen the most recent Spider-Man Far From Home trailer?
I think I've seen... I haven't just sat and watched it, but I think I've seen pieces of it floating around.
Okay, cool.
On the internet and such.
Because it's in the trailer. Are you going to avoid the trailer, or are you going to watch the trailer before you see the film?
No. I've heard enough about it that
cool.
I kind of know what's in there. Yeah.
There's a character from the comics called Mysterio, which, by the way, they nailed the look of Mysterio. Oh my god, it's so perfect. It's so perfect. It's just because they made him look awesome, which is not... It's easy to do on a comic book page. He has this fishbowl helmet. But anyway, he says, I'm from an alternate reality. He actually says that in the film. Now, here's the funny thing. I think he's full of it. Mysterio's a liar. He's always been a liar. That's his character. I think there is an alternate universe. I don't think he's from it.
Yes.
But the thing that I've heard rumblings of is that they're basically saying, yeah, we're not going to start over. We are going to try to do some alternate reality stuff. I have gotten pretty good at being able to guess what storylines they're going to pull from based on things that they've set up. And so I think that we're going to see something for the Marvel Universe called the Illuminati. And the Illuminati in the Marvel Universe is this group of powerful people, including Captain America, Doctor Strange, Black Panther, all these people. I think the underground earthquakes that were mentioned are going to be Namor the Submariner.
I've heard about that,
right?
Yeah.
So I feel like the Illuminati, what in the comics, the role that they played was that they each watched an Infinity Stone. And so I think that is going to be one of the next big things, and I think that's how we're going to meet Reed Richards. He's going to be from an alternate world and all this stuff, but who knows? They always subvert it just enough to where you're surprised, but also fulfilled. But one of the things I was going to do is to kind of jump back onto Endgame.
Wow.
This movie had more epic fan service moments that felt like they held water than anything I've ever seen in my life.
Definitely. I agree 100%. There were with I think I can think of one exception off of hand where I was like, that didn't quite land right for me. But on the whole of it, I totally agree that there was so much of those yes, they did it moments, but it never felt like... Normally when that happens, the alarm kind of goes in my head of okay, so you're just trying to please the crowd. You're not actually trying to tell an important story with this. It's just people have said that it would be cool if, so now it'd be cool if,
Right.
But I didn't feel like that a lot of the time in Endgame. It felt very real and it made sense.
Give me the one. What's the one that you didn't buy?
Okay, so it's a little bit of a controversy sort of thing, so I don't know how much we want to dwell on it. But there was a scene in the final battle part where they kind of like contrivedly have all the female characters like gather in one single frame and kind of do a cool superhero pose.
Sure.
Which it felt a little just like unearned. It felt very just like, let's throw in a girl power moment, even though like the Marvel universe like doesn't have a whole lot of that. It's like kind of notably lacking in a lot of that. So it was just one of those things that kind of after the fact is like, did they really like earn that scene, or is it like just thrown in there? And I could buy either way. But a lot of the big ones like totally hit for me. It was just a weird kind of odd one out.
No, and that's fair. And I think, as someone who is all about empowering women, and I have a daughter, and, I read comic books with her and things like that. I want her to be able to see herself represented. I've seen I have seen the writers admit that they were torn, and they went back and forth. They basically said, look, should we, shouldn't we, should we, shouldn't we, should we, shouldn't we? And I think they finally landed on, it's not going to make the movie worse, and it'll make some people really happy. And so I'm like, that's fine. I'm fine with that. I'm fine with, because it's not like so subversive or strange that it robbed from another character or another moment. Like, if it was a moment where it was in an instead of, if that makes sense. So if it was a moment where it's like, well, normally we'd have this character do this thing, but instead we're going to have the girl group do it, that's when I'd be like, oh no, but don't give it away. It would feel extremely unearned, as you kind of mentioned. But I think overall, I agree with what you're saying, and I think that it just, how do you have so many things that, I'll tell you how. They have set up, probably over the last 20 years, they have set up all of these different through lines and essentially what I was saying is that the writers themselves, even in the meta, said, hey, we went back and forth on whether or not this was something that we should put into the movie, this girl power moment. And they landed on, it's not taking away from anything else. So adding it is going to add something. So the reason why I was okay with it is because they didn't give someone else's moment away in lieu of that. They didn't say, oh, well, we're going to have them do it instead. It was just more like, we're just going to throw this in. So arguably maybe a little too much whipped cream on the sundae, maybe. But you're still eating the sundae.
So I guess here's the more nuanced stance, because I think just saying that I didn't like it isn't good enough in this case of like unearned and like suboptimal representation is better than no representation. So like in that sense, I'm glad that it's in the movie, because I think, like you say, it adds something where nothing was lost as a result. So in that sense, it succeeds. But I wish that they would have done more ahead of time to set these people up for this moment to make it as good as it could have been.
Sure.
Because, like, the reality is, like, none of those characters know each other, basically at all. They have, like, almost no interaction with each other throughout the movies.
Right.
So, like, kind of featuring them as a collective seems a little strange, where I think there's a lot of potential that they could have picked up somewhere along the line. Again, all these movies are so packed with events and story that, like, trying to find places to add things in is like, well, what do you add to a 3-hour movie that's not going to be, too much?
Yeah, and that's fair.
So
even if look, and we're getting granular, but I feel like it's important to note that when you make a flimsy, hand-wavy attempt to set something up, it pays off triple for the audience. If you even nod, if you even wink in a direction and show a couple of characters defending each other and sort of see each other on the field for 2 seconds. The emotional payoff, like I said, it's triple. It's so I agree with what you're saying. I also, I know.
I think.
I was just going to say,
Sorry,
one final thing is I'll say, I know that the Russos have said that they are proud of the fact that they trim microseconds and seconds of seconds off of frames for pacing. So,
yeah, I will say the kind of prove that point in the opposite direction to kind of swoop into I think probably the most successfully received fan service thing ever. Captain America picking up the hammer.
Yes.
And like you say, those tiny little moments, because that was barely hinted at in Age of Ultron, years ago, of he just kind of barely smudges it, and you're not sure if he's if he really could or if it's a whatever. Just that one scene setting up now in Endgame when that moment actually hits and he calls the hammer to him successfully, immediately even from someone who's not as deeply rooted in Marvel, even I was yes, that's awesome. It just felt so good and well done, and like you were saying, to kind of start the fan service thing off of just also simultaneously extremely real to that moment. It felt both it was a great story beat for Captain and the fight against Thanos, and also as this long-running fan service potential moment that they've been kind of subtly hinting at for a while.
Yeah, I think it was just... I'll start by saying I have watched a bootleg copy of that scene on Instagram. It's a 12-second clip, probably 1,000 times. I get as much enjoyment out of that as anything else I've watched this year, just that clip. And you know what, too? There's actually this screaming audience in it. Someone was obviously recording it bootleg. That adds so much for me, because I'm as excited as they are. So when you hear the shouting of yeah, I don't know. So in the Russo brothers have said, Cap always could have picked up the hammer and he just did it. And I'm you know what? Baloney. And you know what? I say the same thing to J.K. Rowling. If it's not in the books, it's not canon to me. So you can create whatever you want as the author, whatever. But if it's not in the film, I get to make my own decisions about it. And my decision was probably a prevailing one, which is Cap wasn't worthy because he had a little too much baggage. He was keeping the secret about Bucky from Tony, is one of the big ones. And he wasn't worthy because, in my opinion, he was a selfless, dutiful sort of weapon aimed at whatever. And I don't think you can be worthy when you're so blindly following. And I think when he became a leader and started making his own choices and started to decide, and I think they mark that it's in Infinity War when he says, basically I'm far past asking permission. And that's, to me, one of the cornerstones of Cap becoming his own leader. He supersedes all of the stuff that was so important to him, which was leadership and hierarchy and following orders. That starts in the elevator scene in Civil War. And it, I think, culminates when he says, I'm far past asking permission. To me, that's when he became worthy. Yeah,
it's definitely interesting. Especially, like you say, it's always tough to balance the words of the author with the text of the author.
Right.
And I tend to agree. I think that logic also comes up a lot in people justifying parts of the movie through parts of the comic, where it's no, you don't get to do that.
Amen to that.
You don't get to shortcut us.
Amen to that.
If you're going to pay something off, it needs to be set up on screen. We need to see it, and it needs to happen, or else it didn't happen, and you don't get to pick and choose, what goes in and what stays out from outside sources. I think it's just nothing. But I do think that I tend to agree with your interpretation of that. At least that's the way it felt to me too. was like during Ultron and kind of going into that, he's always been kind of teetering on the edge of being like a true, worthy hero, whatever you want to say about it. But he's not quite there yet in those films because of that tie to like authority, and authority is obviously in some sense, or most senses, depending on your worldview, corrupt and dangerous. I think at least I'd prefer to see it as a turning point rather than like, oh, I could have done it. I just didn't want to embarrass Thor, and
Exactly.
like it feels a little less powerful to me.
I agree with that.
It's still a valid interpretation, but it doesn't quite hold as much weight to me in doing that.
Yeah, and I think that the Russo brothers, in my opinion, and I think this is why in most cases I side with you on the author's thoughts, is because they're after the fact. So they're formulating those thoughts, obviously with more right to the material than me, but in the same way that I am, in the same process I am, meaning you have had enough time away from it so that you can look at it as a story and make your own viewpoint. Yeah. And so I'm like, yeah, that's your view. And I know you wrote it, and as weird as that sounds, but when it was done, that was your opportunity. Now it's etched, and we both get to give our thoughts on it. I think the Russos, I believe, they came up with that now. I don't believe that that's the idea when Age of Ultron was being written by Joss Whedon. And just for a little bit of comics context, the weight of someone picking up Thor's hammer is huge. The first creature to ever wield Thor's hammer, aside from Thor, is this crazy horse-looking thing named Beta Ray Bill. And so that was a huge, huge deal. And I think that was on Walt Simonson's run of Thor. And it was like, what? Oh my God, Beta Ray Bill's worthy. One of the first and only instances where immediately a character was universally loved. And it's so hard to do that. I think it's totally separate podcast, but I think it's what they tried to do with Captain Marvel. And I feel like for me, the borrowed credibility didn't land.
Yeah, agreed.
But this is the huge upset in the comics. There's a character known as Red Hulk, and I won't tell you who Red Hulk ends up being because it's something they dragged out for 2 years. And they kept saying, we're going to reveal it. And then they kept selling comics. But Red Hulk picks up Thor's hammer, and they kind of make it as like a throwaway moment. And it's like that same thing where they're like, what? Everyone was furious. Like, he's not worthy. And so they were trying to make him cool. Like, he picked up Thor's, look how cool he is. And we were all like, no, boo, lies. So that was, I think, a really good payoff in the movie.
Yeah, and you do always have to be very careful about when and how you're going to drop bombs like that, because it can very, very quickly. Like, if even like one other person picks up Thor's hammer in like the next 5 years of movie, it's immediately going to be lame.
Yep.
Like, it's going to be... Yep. It's going to look and feel stupid no matter what the circumstance is. Like, because of how much magnitude that something like that carries when it's such a rare and single moment. So I really, really hope that it doesn't start to turn into that with these moments, where like the comic books kind of have, from what I've heard, of like at this stage, like Thor's hammer has just been passed around.
It really is.
It's made the rounds to everybody, and so the longer that the MCU goes, the more I think that you start to get a little bit risky with some of these character moments of like that dropped in, and like it dropping in Endgame was like the perfect time for it to drop. And I hope that the people going forwards with the next movies, and I'm sure they'll do it well. Their track record has been pretty spot on so far.
And I was going to say, as long as the same people are at the helm, I think that these particular people, including the editor, which I don't think the editor, I feel bad, I don't know his name. The editor of the film is the one who came up with the I Am Iron Man snap.
Yep, I've heard that. Yeah.
And so my point being is, I think as long as the people who have their entire emotion invested into this, I think that they are good caretakers, and I hope that what you're saying is true, where they're like, nah. I think, too, I have to give kudos to Joss Whedon, Joss Whedon did an incredible job of having Vision pick up the hammer, and it served a really, really good purpose, because you're like, why are they going to trust him right now?
Yeah.
What? That's ridiculous. And so what a really smart way, and how he just like handed, like, we have no time to lose. You're like, oh wow, that's really well done. The other moment I wanted to hit on was Cap saying Avengers Assemble. From the comics, that has been his tagline since a very long time ago. And so you can see, if you Google Avengers Assemble comics, you see there's tons of scenes of him just shout. He shouts it all the time. And so, you know, did it make sense for him to yell it after they'd all assembled? Probably not, but I don't care. You know, that was the time when you have all... Jeff, that was every Marvel character that exists. Like, you have... It felt... To me, it felt like a giant-size annual comic. And I think Kevin Smith says the same thing in his review, where all the intellectual properties there, it felt like this huge mega crossover event. To put that tentpole in it and have him... and the way he delivers it, Avengers, assemble. I was like, every time I see that, I get goosebumps. Like, they did it. They did the thing, and they did the thing at the time. I'm like, when else?
Yeah, and I mean, just such a monumental moment, like, not just in the story of the universe, but just as far as, like, filmmaking, like the logistics that go into making a scene like that, where you have dozens and dozens of like top level actors and characters and stories and everything, to like have them put all into like a singular moment is just like, there's nothing else but like historic to say about it. Like, there's 22 movies and like however many 10 years or whatever worth of time and effort that built into that moment. So I agree. That's like, if you're gonna have the Avengers Assemble thrown in there, like, it's just, that's got to be the time. Like, and they actually, it's funny because they have actually hinted. They've teased it a couple times throughout, where he'll be like Avengers and then cut to credits, or you know, something like stuff like that. So they've kind of played around with it a little bit. So it actually is kind of set up in the movies. Still, you never see it, but you kind of get the hint that that's starting to become his thing. So even that kind of has its time. It's like, oh yes, it's justified in and out of movie for that line to be delivered to that extent.
And I loved that they did that. And if you watch the outtake is hilarious, because it's the end, and I think it's the end of Civil War, I think is when it is. Might be end of Age of Ultron, I can't remember. But he goes...
One of those two,
he's like, Avengers... like, you know, he actually like does the thing, and so I thought, oh man, that's so perfect. But you know, and this, I wouldn't say this is necessarily a hot take, but as someone who is, I don't know, I just want to come out and say it, and I want to say that to me, Endgame firmly solidified that this is our generation Star Wars for me. Because there has not been a cultural phenomenon the same. Am I saying it's better than, it's different than? I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is, in the same way that Michael Jackson's record Thriller broke so many records because of what it was for when it came out, there have to be advances and evolutions in music to have a release that big because of the changing times. And I feel like this is that evolution. To do something as powerful as Star Wars was in the 70s, you have to do it over 22 movies and have it build up like this. But I think that it's the same sort of pillar and signpost for our generation that, like, I know I'm going to raise my daughter watching Marvel Comics movies. You know what I mean? What are your thoughts on that? And again, I want to make it clear, it's not a better than, it's a, this fills that role culturally as Star Wars.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, there just flat out has never been a moment like Endgame in film history. Like, there's no other project in cinema that has had that kind of scope, where you can have so long of time and so many movies contributing that have kind of all pyramid built up into this singular top point. Like, I just can't think of any other event that's in filmmaking that even comes close to something like that, just in terms of the sheer construction of it. So I in terms of like a cultural touchstone, like 100%, like the moment that I sat down to watch it, I hadn't even seen the movie yet. Already there was kind of this feeling of like, this is going to be a defining point,
Wow.
in media.
Wow. Yeah.
Like, this is going to be a thing that people will look back on and be like, yeah, remember Return of the Jedi? Remember Endgame? That kind of culmination point
Yes.
of like an intensely loved and popular event.
Yeah, and I think that what that makes me think of too, because I think you are so clearly right to me that the way that this built up is just, it's almost unfair. Like, nothing else has ever had this opportunity. Now, granted, I think, and this is a side topic about the Star Wars universe and Disney, I believe that Disney tried for the same kind of momentum by saying, okay, cool, we're going to do another trilogy, and their schedule of releasing the Star Wars stories, that they've had, like Solo and Rogue One. But I think the reason why they haven't resonated is not because people don't love Star Wars. It's because they didn't have the same characters building off of one another. And I think that just because it's a Marvel movie, that wouldn't have worked. What worked is Hulk being in Thor Ragnarok and his arc having a real meaningful progression in it. And this character, and in Civil War, was kind of like a mini Avengers movie and their arcs. And I think that's why Disney is choosing to put a pin in Star Wars after this. And then I think they announced they're going to reboot it in 3 years. I think the reboot is going to be their Star Wars cinematic universe, like 2.0, where they're going to try to build it as a framework where everything's connected for 10 years.
Yeah, it's a really kind of interesting point, because I think kind of a good analogy to kind of, I think, if I'm understanding what you're trying to say, and correct me if I'm wrong, is like what they're doing with Star Wars is like if we only saw the Avengers titled movies. Like if you just went like Avengers, Age of Ultron,
Yes.
I'm going to count Civil War because it's close enough.
Yeah.
Infinity War, Endgame, and like that was all that you got. Like, you would not, Endgame would not have the same payoff, even remotely close, if that was our Marvel movie experience. And that's what basically all other movie franchises are working with right now.
Right.
Like, you don't get the level of like a Racer movie, a Kylo Ren movie, we did get a Han Solo movie, but it was not tied into now, like it was a prequel thing. Like, if we had individual movies kind of building all these people up in a compelling way, and then you get, the big trilogy that combines them all, then I think you have the potential to start reaching into the level that Marvel has gotten. But just almost no film company or project can justify that level. I mean, Star Wars probably could, but it hasn't done that at the very least. If it could, it's chosen not to.
Sure. Yeah, and I think you're right. And I think to take that, you're understanding me exactly. And then to take that even further, it would be like, instead of an Ant-Man and the Wasp and a Black Panther and those tie-ins in the present, exactly what you said about Solo, I feel like the reason why it didn't hit is because you weren't telling me a story that matters now. I loved Solo, so that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is it doesn't have the same power of drawing all these characters together, and the reason why these standalone movies worked is because they furthered characters you already love and their arcs. So it would be like if you're to use your example, all the Avengers movies, and then the Doctor Strange movie was a prequel that had nothing to do with them. It was just, yeah, hey, this is set in the Marvel Universe. It's like, that doesn't make it bad, but it doesn't make it tied in. It doesn't make me care. It doesn't make me want to go, oh my God. Like, I think that Spider-Man Far From Home is going to make way more money than the other Spider-Man films because it's the thing after Endgame. If they were to tell a prequel story, I think it would do meh. It would do fine. It would make money, but it's, you know what I mean?
That was actually one of the problems that I had with a couple of the movies, like even outside of looking them at individual movies. Ant-Man and the Wasp and Captain Marvel, which I think were the only two between Infinity War and Endgame.
I think so. I don't remember.
Like both of those movies felt like such a lowering of stakes to me, knowing that Infinity War had already happened and Endgame was going to happen.
Yeah.
That it was just like so difficult to care about what was happening in those stories.
Sure.
Just like, why are you doing this? Like, everyone just wants to know where this is going, and instead you're telling us, you know, Captain Marvel's like 50 years before.
Yeah.
So it's like it felt a lot more difficult to like buy into the overarching story that they were telling with the universe in both of those movies for me for exactly that reason. Like, you're not telling me anything new. You're not making me care more about what's happening. You're just kind of jumping to a random point and, you know, telling a little side tale, which is, it's fine, but it's not change your life emotional impact fine.
Yeah.
It's just whatever.
Exactly. And I agree with that wholeheartedly. You know, and I think, you know, to kind of start wrapping it up, I feel like there's something that happened for me, which was for like 2 days, maybe 3 days after seeing this movie, I was strangely elated and very kind of depressed.
Wow.
And the reason is because the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and I try to explain this to people, but I feel like I'm an old man shaking my cane, but I don't mean it. It's not a gatekeepery way. It's just let me show you from my perspective. Mm-hmm. When we first saw an Iron Man movie where the costume looked like Iron Man, that was a miracle. That it even looked like Iron Man and that the character's name was Tony Stark and that he was a billionaire, because up to that point, comic book movies were like retellings. They were not the comic book. And so there was a time when I first started watching comic book movies that Iron Man was like, oh my God, they finally did one. Because even Sam Raimi's Spider-Man is so different than Spider-Man. But it's, I'll take it, you know? So that layer where my brothers and I, at the time, when they even hinted at Captain America, when they hinted at it, we were like, oh man, what do you think they'll do? Do you think they'll do it? Do you think he'll have the shield? Understand that. We were asking if he'll have the shield because that's the place we were in. So, so to have that, okay, now add the layer that my dad raised us on comic books. So we would get comics as kids. We would, you know, we'd go to the comic store. This is built into my childhood. My brothers and I have a huge bond over comics. And so we would go see these films together. My wife and I, the first movie we ever saw together when we were dating was Iron Man. So these films have slowly boiled us in this culture, but to fathom the fact that we went from will there be a Captain America movie and will he have a shield to Cap wielding Mjolnir and doing it in a way that is iconic and epic and amazing. What I did for this final film was I bought 2 rows of a theater. I just dropped a ton of money, Jeff, because I knew that on April 2nd, when those tickets went on sale, I knew that me and a couple other members of my family were the only ones who would really make it happen. But it was really important for me to go as an entire family. And I bought 2 rows, and I invited my cousins, all of my brothers, my parents, my wife. I almost brought my daughter. She's 4, so I thought it might be a little intense, but I almost did. I came this close to it. The real reason I didn't is because I thought there's a ton of language in there, and I don't know. I don't want her walking out of Avengers and her first word is, her first swear word is shit because she saw, what. So
Yeah.
Anyway, this culmination of seeing this together as a family, there was a serious moment of this can never happen again.
Yeah.
And it felt so final and fleeting. And I was like, this can never happen again. And so that is my long, long way of telling you that it's like, I for real, for like 3 days afterward, felt like something bad had happened.
Oh, yeah, interesting. It's always so difficult to wrestle with those like peak highs in life because like I know exactly how you feel. Not with Marvel because it wasn't quite so woven into like me as a person. Like I loved it and I thought it was great, but it's not like I'm not in the same situation as you are, where I was born into comic books and it's been such a big part of my family. It's just like no, I just really like it. But I have had that experience in other areas of life of like you finish something amazing and part of you is like, oh my gosh, that was so amazing and we built so much into this. And then there's suddenly that gap of like, and now it's gone. And like, what does that even mean? Like for it to be gone, how can it be gone?
Yes.
Like it's been there for so long. Like it's a very weird duality to explore.
That's a great word, duality. That's how I felt because I was elated. I was so glad that they stuck the landing, To me, they did. I mean, I don't know if they could have done it better with all of the spinning plates, that I talked about. And
yeah,
there were so many feelings of like, oh my God, what just happened? All those things paid off. It just happened. Like you said, but then there was that drop of, I just remember the drive to work the next day, just feeling like, what next? What could possibly compete with that? Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think I decided early on that I wasn't going to rewatch all the movies leading up to this.
Oh,
I purposefully was like, no, I saw the cliff. And I said, I'll probably be really bummed out. So I'm going to wait and I'm going to rewatch after. And so I'm about to actually start a rewatch. And
nice.
That's what I've decided is the way that I'm going to keep this going is I've only seen most of these movies a pair of times, 3 times. But I'm like, I've got 22 movies to watch as many times as I want and to watch with my daughter and to rewatch and to, so that's given me sort of this, because it's not like I'm really depressed over it.
Yeah,
but it was a very tangible sadness. But I thought every year my family and I have always watched Lord of the Rings on Thanksgiving and Black Friday. When you come over my house there's always one of them playing, and we even got to the point to where we remember which one was last year, so we rotate to the next one. And so, I think I'm going to start weaving that into other holidays. Like I thought, okay, so cool. So like on 4th of July, when everyone comes over, I'm going to put on Iron Man and start to build these traditions and stuff. So anyway, I feel like that's kind of my final thought on Endgame was, I have this next phase of enjoying it for the rest of my life.
Definitely. So speaking of next phases, I'm curious to kind of see. Not asking you to predict the future, obviously, but like, where do you think the immediate next step is? So, like after, like let's say after Spider-Man, so Phase 4 official. Like, what do you want to see? And if it's different than what you want to see, what do you think is kind of the next building point? Like, what's the next first step and what's the next Thanos,
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a great question. So I believe that we're going to I believe that the next big thing is they're going to introduce, and I think they'll do it slowly, the way they know how to do and focused. And they're going to spread it out. We're going to see the Fantastic Four and we're going to see the X-Men. And I think that the way that they're going to do that is from a very meta perspective, thinking of it as a writer, you have a lot of huge shoes to fill. So you have to have these characters that people absolutely adore. And so I think that what we're going to see is a very distinct shift. And there's in phase 4, you're going to have this terrestrial character group. But I believe that we're also going to start seeing where Captain Marvel leads us. And I think that they're going to do more of what we call the cosmic heroes. So you're going to meet Silver Surfer. You're going to meet Nova. You're going to meet the villain Annihilus, who comes from the Negative Zone, big Fantastic Four villain. Mm-hmm. So I think what they're going to do is they're going to plant the Fantastic Four as the sort of Iron Man of that is going to be the main arc, and their stories are going to be the main arc. And I think that we're going to see the introduction of cosmic threats now that the stones are gone. So I think you're going to see the Eternals, which are the sort of celestial beings that are tied to the stones. I think their role is going to be, hey, why'd you break all our stones? Like what happened. And I think that there's going to be sort of their role in the Marvel Universe is going to be filling the gap that the stones left to give them a purpose. And that's how they're going to tie into the heroes. I think we are going to start to see multiverse stuff. So I think they're going to have to tread lightly, because once you start doing that, as you mentioned, stakes, they don't matter because it's this world versus that world. Yeah. So I think that is going to be the next phase. Is Doctor Doom is going to be your sort of villain I think he's going to be a multi-movie villain. I don't think they're going to get rid of him right away.
I hope so, yeah. Him being a one-off villain, I don't think would fit at all with what level that he plays and everything that I've heard about Marvel cosmology.
Yeah, he's just an amazing villain, and he's just he has to be a recurring, consistent, overarching villain. But I think with him, you have the introduction of the eventual end of the phase, the next 10 years, I do believe is Galactus. That means Silver Surfer and Annihilus. So what the thing that they are going to have to do, and this is what I was telling my wife, for this phase, we're going to have to see the existing characters grow into their role. So these characters that we love, because you lost your 2 top characters, their most universally loved characters. And so having the other characters fill in that role as you introduce new people, so that I don't get fatigued, so that I care about all these new characters. But the biggest worry I have with anything cosmic is that I love Guardians, I love Ragnarok, but my favorite stories are the ones you were describing, which is boots on the ground, gritty realism, high stakes, but flawed, mortal creatures fighting insurmountable odds is just my jam. And so that's it. That's kind of the big, sort of lore dump. But I think that's the next big moving pieces of what we're going to see.
Yeah, I pretty much agree, almost entirely with what you said. I don't have a whole lot to add there. One thing I just wanted to highlight that I think is super, super critical is going to be, as we start moving further into the cosmic sphere of power scale, which we've kind of just started to touch into now, the further that we get into multiverses and cosmic powers and everything, they're going to need to really be careful about trying to avoid, I think, one of the traps that comic books has fallen into of training people that nothing matters. It's if you can time travel and you can dimension travel and you can build and destroy planets with a snap, at a certain scale, it just starts to become all spectacle with no substance. It's just flashing lights on a screen, because if somebody dies, you time travel and you save them, or you go to a different universe and you grab that version of it's just become so easy for the stakes to become meaningless and for the floor to just fall out from under everything.
Yes.
So it's going to be really interesting to see. But at the same time, you can't just scale down from Thanos either. You have to keep going. So managing that kind of impossible seesaw of increasing the scale of cosmic, danger.
Yes.
So that you don't want to peak at Thanos and then fall below that and never go back up to meet it or above it, because then it just feels like such a strange, like, early climax for what's going to be like decades of movies.
Yeah.
But the further you go, the more that you risk falling into that trap of like, oh, and then Iron Man's back again. Oh, but this is the fourth time he's died, and now he's coming back to life again. And it's just like, it's become so, just like, it makes it lose kind of the punch, like what we were saying with Mjolnir. If everyone's picked up Mjolnir, then it doesn't matter that anyone's picked up Mjolnir.
Right. It's
anymore.
like, oh, who's doing it this week?
So,
I completely agree with that. And I think, so the way that I could see this going, and the way that I would try to solve it in the writer's room is, we put a lot of eggs in the basket of the Infinity Stones, and then we had Thanos practically kill himself to destroy them. We then went on a time heist to get them back, and then we put them back. So what I would lean on is the new landscape post-Thanos is everything is screwed up, and I would visit in the same way that each one of the films focused on a MacGuffin that contained a stone, and you would find that that would be the threat. I would focus those mini arcs around the void that the stones left. So what happens when the Soul Stone is gone? And what creature comes forth from that? And, you know, maybe that's Annihilus, or basically Dormammu from the Time Gem, or the version of that. Yeah. Like, what is the new creature? And I think we're going to see a Doctor Strange villain known as Nightmare, if I have to guess. Another big one. Because one of the things they're really good at doing, too, is saying, all right, who are the top rogues in the rogues gallery? And let's pump them in. Let's move them through the line, and let's do it in a great way. They didn't have to put the Vulture in Spider-Man Homecoming. But they did. And it worked so perfectly, because I think so many studios would have avoided, it's the Vulture, no. But because of his history in Spider-Man lore, no, he's in the lineup. So, like, do you understand we're going to get to see a Marvel Cinematic Universe Dr. Octopus? You know that's in the pipeline. Oh, yeah. You know we're going to see a Green Goblin. You know we're going to see Venom. And that's what I'm saying. They're going to have enough of these treasure troves, these pieces, where that's how I would handle it. The new landscape is, what voids did these absences create, both cosmically and like in the forces of nature, but also what creatures are coming skulking out of the darkness because, as you mentioned, like Galactus now is coming to eat our whole universe because there's nothing to defeat him.
Yeah, definitely. I just really hope that we stay away from reversal territory.
Agreed.
I think they set such a good precedence in Endgame of like, no, what's happened has happened, and there's nothing that you can do about that. Of like, I hope, as much as I love all the characters that I'm about to say, like, they're great, I hope we never see Tony Stark again.
Agreed.
I hope we never see Black Widow again, or Vision, or, you know, all the, like, as long as we stay away from that point of like, you know, what happens matters, as long as we stay in that point of like, what's happened has happened, and that is important that it did happen, then I'll be happy with going into the future, whatever power scale that they get into.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think in the same way, I wouldn't mind if Steve Rogers was around, but I don't want him young again.
Yes.
Like, I don't mind if old Captain America with super soldier serum in his veins is the wise sage who is sitting on the Illuminati Council. You know what I mean? And he's basically, you know, I don't mind that. One of the only, so I'll give a caveat because I agree with everyone you said. The only one who I would totally buy them bringing back would be Vision, because he's artificial intelligence. But I would want to see an arc there. I would want to see a loss of humanity, and I would want to see more of that sort of Jarvis, sort of something missing, something wrong, something askew, and him trying to figure that out. But subverted enough so it's not the standard, I'm a robot that doesn't understand humans, you know.
Yeah, for sure. Although I guess with Tony gone, he was kind of the architect of both Ultron and Jarvis, and he's not there to fix them.
Right.
So,
but we do have Shuri from Wakanda.
True.
So I'm like,
Yep.
and so there's also in the comics there actually was a gray version of Vision. So I wonder if they bring him back, if he wouldn't have his color, if he'd be gray.
Oh,
Because when Thanos ripped his gem out, that so that he had that gray like sort of. We're like, what? So it's so fun to speculate, and I just love that we have a Phase 4. I love that we're looking forward to X-Men and the Fantastic Four. And I think the X-Men are how you're going to keep your terrestrial grounding because there are so many of them and they're still on the ground. Let me tell you, though, I think we're all worried that we're like, look, we're done. We're tired. We've seen so many X-Men movies that it's like, I kind of just... But Marvel always turns it around and goes, yeah, but you haven't seen Wolverine in a brown suit yet.
I was going to say, everybody said that about the third Spider-Man reboot, and Spider-Man in Civil War and Homecoming is, like, definitely the best one.
Absolutely.
Like, I'm just going to, like, put a hard-line stance that, like, the Tom Holland MCU Spider-Man is, like, head and shoulders better than the other two, even going in fatigued about Spider-Man.
Yeah, you're spot on.
So,
you're spot on. And I remember seeing that trailer thinking, I don't know if I'm going to see that. And then I saw...
A third Spider-Man reboot? Seriously? Yeah.
And then I saw him in Civil War, and I was like, I cannot wait for that movie.
Exactly. So I'm sure if they bring in all these new parties and the old hat movies and the X-Men and, you know, that it'll be in a way that they tie in to the MCU rather than, you know, I don't think they're going to port over the X-Men series that's been going on. I think they're going to plant the seeds and water it in the same way that they did with Spider-Man. At least I hope so.
I hope so too, and I think I wouldn't be surprised if mutants are brand new. Because I
was going to say,
the stones
they plant that little Easter egg of like the stones put out radiation, and that's always kind of a secret code word for mutation too.
Sure.
So that could very easily be an obvious. The snap happens, it sends this huge burst of radiation, and suddenly people start to, a couple years down the line, maybe 5 years or so down the line from that happening, things start to happen a little weird.
Absolutely.
You know, they've done a great job of already kind of incidentally planting in tie-ins for all these other franchise characters without ever like explicitly saying that that's the point of it.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we have seen, we know for a fact in a post-credit scene that the reason that Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver, who were originally mutants in the comics, have their powers is because they were experimented on with one of the Soul Stones, or one of the Infinity Stones.
Yeah, the Mind Stone.
The Mind Stone, yeah. And so one of the things that I think we're going to see is, and already I'm interested, is like, look, I would be fine with, in present day, Bruce Banner and all the rest of the people who are alive are like, I don't know, we got these new people are calling them mutants. And putting and it's like, what? And then you have a Magneto rise, and you have and the way that they're so good at doing this is that they would have Magneto in a separate movie first. Or, you know, have some mutants or whatever. And so it's like, oh God, they're so good at that, like introducing stuff. And so, yeah, I think it's really cool. I think they have all the pieces, and now it's just like, how are you going to place them? What's your move here? So,
yeah.
Cool, man. Well, this has been
awesome.
A lot of fun.
For sure.
I think we've been going for like 2 hours?
Almost, yeah, a bit under.
That's amazing. No regrets, not even a single one.
So. I was gonna say I didn't even realize that I kept like looking at the clock and be like, It's already been like an hour and a half?
That's crazy.
It felt like nothing.
Yeah, man.
Yeah, I think that's probably a pretty good flag to plant in the ground to at least mark things off, though.
Awesome. So I'll go ahead and hit stop.
Yeah.
All right.